Martha Roberts, a quiet and resilient woman in her mid-40s, had lived her entire life in the small, unassuming town of Willowbrook. The town, known for its sprawling meadows and a single bustling main street, had always been a place where life moved at a predictable, comforting pace. For Martha, however, life was anything but predictable on the fateful Thursday afternoon that changed everything. It began like any other day. The sun filtered through the lace curtains of her modest kitchen as she sipped her usual morning tea, the radio playing softly in the background. The news was its usual blend of mundane and forgettable, but Martha barely listened. Her thoughts were preoccupied with the chaos left behind by Greg, her husband of 2 decades, who had walked out of their home just days earlier. He hadn't even bothered with a proper goodbye, leaving only a hastily scribbled note on the dining table. "I can't do this anymore. Don't try to contact me. Greg." The words played on a loop in her mind, as if etched there permanently. She had read them so many times that she could recite them in her sleep. It wasn't the first time Greg had threatened to leave, but this time felt different. He was gone, and the silence of their once shared home was deafening. Martha couldn't deny the sting of his departure, but beneath the heartbreak was a simmering anger that surprised even her. Greg had left her not only emotionally shattered but financially vulnerable. Years of his impulsive spending, failed get-rich-quick schemes, and sporadic gambling had drained their savings. Now, Martha was left with a stack of bills and a sinking feeling of helplessness. As the day wore on, Martha decided to venture out to the local grocery store to stock up on essentials. The trip was more about distraction than necessity. The thought of staying in her empty house for another moment was unbearable. She moved through the aisles robotically, picking up bread, milk, and canned soup, until she arrived at the checkout counter. "Hey, Martha," said Jenny, the young cashier with a perpetual smile. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders." Martha mustered a faint smile. "Just one of those weeks, Jenny." As she reached into her purse to pay, her fingers brushed against a crumpled piece of paper. Pulling it out, she realized it was a lottery ticket, a relic of Greg's last impulsive purchase before he left. He had bought it during one of his lucky streaks, insisting that their fortune was about to change. Martha had rolled her eyes at the time, stuffing the ticket into her purse without a second thought. "Want me to check that for you?" Jenny asked, gesturing to the ticket. Martha hesitated. She had little faith in the odds, and the ticket felt like a cruel reminder of Greg's recklessness. But something in Jenny's cheerful demeanor nudged her forward. "Sure, why not?" Martha replied with a shrug, sliding the ticket across the counter. Jenny scanned the ticket, her smile fading as her eyes widened in disbelief. She looked up at Martha, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Martha, I think you need to sit down." Confused and slightly alarmed, Martha leaned closer. "What? Is something wrong?" Jenny shook her head, her hands trembling as she held the ticket. You won the jackpot." The words hung in the air, like an electric charge. Martha's heart raced as she struggled to process what she had just heard. "What do you mean? How much?" $10 million, Jenny whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else overheard. Martha's legs felt like jelly. She grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief, excitement, and fear. $10 million? It didn't seem real. Just days ago, she had been crying over Greg's departure, worrying about how she would make ends meet. Now, she was holding a ticket that could change her life forever. As the reality of her win began to sink in, Martha's thoughts were a jumble of possibilities and doubts. She could pay off her debts, buy a new home, and start fresh. But with that excitement came a creeping sense of unease. What would people think? How would this sudden windfall change her relationships, her life, and even herself? Before she could fully process her emotions, Jenny handed her the ticket with a nervous grin. "You need to keep this safe, Martha. And maybe think about getting a lawyer." Martha nodded absently, clutching the ticket like a lifeline. She could already feel the weight of the decision ahead of her. This wasn't just about the money, It was about what she would do with it and how it would shape the next chapter of her life. As she walked out of the store, the world around her seemed different, sharper, and more vivid. The sun was brighter, the air crisper, and her heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time in a long time, Martha felt a spark of hope. But little did she know, the real challenges and surprises were only just beginning. Martha Roberts had always been the picture of resilience. She grew up in Willowbrook, a small town where everyone knew each other's names and secrets. Her parents had owned a tiny hardware store on Main Street, a business that had just barely scraped by but instilled in Martha the values of hard work and humility. She was an unassuming woman, not one to draw attention to herself, but she had always been dependable, someone her friends and neighbors could rely on in a pinch. Her life had been simple but steady until she met Greg. He was charming, full of big dreams and even bigger promises. Greg had blown into town one summer like a whirlwind, sweeping Martha off her feet with his infectious laughter and stories of a brighter future. He had convinced her that life wasn't meant to be lived on the sidelines, that they were destined for something greater. At the time, Martha believed him. Their early years of marriage were happy, though financially tight. Greg worked odd jobs, always insisting that his big break was just around the corner. Martha supported his dreams, even as they moved from one failed venture to another. First, it was a small cafe that closed after a year. Then, it was a landscaping business that never got off the ground. When Greg discovered online gambling, Martha's patience began to wear thin, but she stayed, hoping he would change. Over the years, Greg's optimism turned to frustration, and his frustrations turned toward Martha. He began blaming her for their lack of success, accusing her of not believing in him enough. The once loving man who had promised her the world became bitter and distant. Martha endured his mood swings and their financial instability because she believed in the vows they had made. She thought things would eventually get better. But Greg had other plans. The day he left, the house had been unusually quiet. Martha had come home from her part-time job at the local library to find Greg's closet half empty and the note on the dining table. She stood there for a long time, staring at the jagged handwriting that seemed to mock her. "I can't do this anymore. Don't try to contact me. Greg." The words felt like a slap, but the anger didn't hit her immediately. Instead, there was a hollow ache, the kind that comes from realizing someone you've given your life to no longer values you. For hours, she sat in the silence of their home, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She replayed every argument, every moment of tension, trying to pinpoint where things had gone so wrong. The days that followed were a blur of sadness and practicalities. Martha had bills to pay, a house to maintain, and a reputation to uphold. Willowbrook was the kind of town where news traveled fast, and Greg's departure was no exception. Neighbors would stop her on the street, their faces full of pity and poorly concealed curiosity. "I'm so sorry, Martha," they'd say, as if her heartbreak was some sort of spectacle. Despite her pain, Martha refused to crumble. She threw herself into her routines, trying to fill the void Greg had left behind. She spent her mornings at the library, shelving books and helping children find their next adventure story. In the afternoons, she tended to her small garden, finding solace in the steady rhythm of planting and pruning. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that she first came across the lottery ticket. Greg had bought it during one of his lucky streaks, as he liked to call them. He'd been convinced that the universe owed him a win, that he was destined for greatness. Martha had rolled her eyes at the time, tucking the ticket into her purse and promptly forgetting about it. Now, holding it in her hands again, she couldn't help but feel a pang of bitterness. It was a symbol of everything Greg had been: reckless, impulsive, and full of unfulfilled promises. Still, she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. Something about the ticket felt unfinished, like a chapter of her life that hadn't yet been written. She tucked it back into her purse, not realizing that it would soon become the catalyst for a transformation she couldn't have imagined. In the days leading up to her trip to the grocery store, Martha began to notice subtle changes in herself. She was no longer walking around in a daze, consumed by thoughts of Greg. Instead, she felt a spark of determination, a quiet resolve to take control of her life. She began making lists of bills to pay, projects to tackle, and dreams she'd long put on hold. For the first time in years, she started to think about what she wanted, independent of Greg and his endless schemes. Martha's best friend, Linda, was the only person she confided in during this time. Linda had been her rock since childhood, a fiercely loyal and brutally honest confidant. When Martha told her about Greg's departure, Linda's response was characteristically blunt. "Good riddance," she'd said, pouring them both a generous glass of wine. "You deserve better than that fool." It was Linda who first joked about the lottery ticket. One evening, as they sat on Martha's porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Linda nudged her playfully. "Wouldn't it be something if that ticket turned out to be a winner?" she said with a laugh. "Can you imagine Greg's face if you hit the jackpot after he walked out?" Martha had laughed along, though the idea seemed absurd. The odds of winning were astronomical, and she wasn't the type to believe in fairy tale endings. But Linda's words stuck with her, planting a seed of curiosity that would grow into something far greater than either of them could have anticipated. The grocery store visit was meant to be a mundane errand, a break from the monotony of her daily life. But as Jenny scanned the lottery ticket and revealed the life-altering news, everything Martha thought she knew about her life shifted in an instant. In that moment, standing in the bright fluorescent light of the checkout aisle, Martha felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: disbelief, excitement, and fear. Winning $10 million was the kind of thing that happened to other people, not to someone like her. Yet here she was, holding a golden ticket that had the power to change everything. As she left the store with the ticket clutched tightly in her hand, Martha couldn't help but think about Greg. What would he say if he knew? Would he come crawling back, full of apologies and excuses? The thought made her stomach churn. But for the first time in years, Martha realized that Greg's opinion didn't matter. This was her moment, her opportunity to rewrite the story of her life. And as she walked home under the fading light of the evening sky, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. What Martha didn't know was that her journey was only just beginning. The lottery win would bring challenges she could never have anticipated, forcing her to confront not only her past, but also the person she wanted to become. And in the small, interconnected world of Willowbrook, her sudden fortune would ripple through the lives of everyone around her, leaving no one unchanged. The news of her lottery win spread faster than Martha could have imagined. At first, she thought she could keep it quiet, share the secret with only a few trusted friends while she figured out her next steps. But in a town like Willowbrook, secrets had a way of slipping through even the tightest lips. By the end of the week, nearly everyone knew that Martha Roberts, the quiet school teacher with a life overshadowed by heartbreak, had become a millionaire overnight. For Martha, the initial days were a whirlwind of emotions. She spent hours staring at the ticket, alternating between excitement and sheer panic. $10 million was a number so enormous that it didn't even feel real. Every decision she made now carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. Should she call the lottery office immediately or wait until she had a plan? Could she trust anyone to help her navigate this sudden windfall? And most importantly, what kind of life did she want to build now that she had the chance? Martha's first call was to Linda, her best friend and confidant. When Linda answered, Martha tried to keep her voice steady, but her words spilled out in a frantic rush. "Linda, I don't know what to do. It's so much money, I can't even wrap my head around it." Linda let out a low whistle on the other end of the line. "Well, first of all, congratulations, you lucky woman. Secondly, don't do anything rash. You need a lawyer, an accountant, and a plan. And Martha, for the love of all things holy, don't tell Greg." The mention of Greg sent a chill down Martha's spine. In the days since he had walked out, she hadn't heard a word from him. Part of her hoped that he was gone for good, that he was too proud or distracted to ever look back. But another part of her, the part that had lived through years of his impulsive decisions and manipulative tendencies, knew better. Greg had a knack for showing up when it benefited him most. And Martha had no illusions about what he would do if he found out she was suddenly worth millions. Despite Linda's advice to keep quiet, the town had other plans. Within days, Martha became the reluctant center of attention. Neighbors she hadn't spoken to in years showed up at her doorstep with casseroles, baked goods, and thinly veiled questions about her plans. Strangers approached her in the grocery store, offering unsolicited advice on how to invest her money. The local newspaper even published a feature on her win, complete with a grainy photo of her standing in front of her modest home, clutching the ticket in her hand. Amid the chaos, Martha realized that her life was no longer her own. The win had brought her a kind of fame she never wanted, and the pressure of it all began to take a toll. She found herself questioning the motives of even her closest friends, wondering who genuinely cared about her and who was simply angling for a piece of the fortune. Her first test came sooner than she expected. On a cold, gray morning just a week after the win, there was a knock at her door. When Martha opened it, her heart sank. Standing on the porch, looking sheepish but determined, was Greg. "Martha," he said, his voice soft and apologetic. "Can we talk?" She stared at him, her mind racing. He looked the same as always, disheveled but oddly charming, with that crooked smile that had once made her heart flutter. But now, all she felt was a mix of anger and suspicion. "What do you want, Greg?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. Greg sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I made a mistake. Walking out on you, it was the biggest mistake of my life. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I want to make things right. I want us to start over." Martha almost laughed. The audacity of it all was staggering. For 20 years, she had stood by Greg through his schemes, his failures, and his excuses. And now, after leaving her with nothing but a pile of bills and a broken heart, he wanted to come back. "Greg," she said, folding her arms across her chest, "why now? Why after all this time?" He hesitated, his eyes darting to the side. "I've been struggling, Martha. Things haven't been easy for me since I left. And I realized that you're the only good thing I ever had." It was a carefully crafted answer, but Martha could see through it. She had learned over the years to recognize the subtle tells that gave away Greg's lies, the way he avoided eye contact, the slight tremor in his voice. What Greg didn't know was that Martha had already heard rumors about his mounting debts. He had burned bridges with half the town, borrowing money he couldn't repay and gambling it away on poker games and horse races. His return had nothing to do with love and everything to do with desperation. But instead of confronting him, Martha decided to play along. "Let me think about it," she said, her voice measured. "I'll call you in a few days." Greg looked relieved, even hopeful, as he walked away. But as soon as he was out of sight, Martha called Linda. "You're not going to believe this," she said, recounting the encounter. Linda groaned. "I told you he'd come crawling back. What are you going to do?" Martha didn't answer right away. She had spent years letting Greg dictate the terms of their relationship, but this time, the power was hers. She wasn't sure yet how she would handle him, but one thing was certain, she wasn't going to let him take advantage of her again. As she hung up the phone, Martha realized that her win wasn't just about money. It was about freedom, the freedom to make her own choices, to stand up for herself, and to build a life on her own terms. But the challenges were far from over. The pressures of newfound wealth, the shifting dynamics in her relationships, and the growing presence of Greg in her life were all building to a crescendo. And as Martha navigated the complexities of her new reality, she began to uncover truths about herself, and the people around her, that she had never seen before. What she didn't know was that an even bigger twist was waiting just around the corner, one that would force her to confront her past, her future, and everything she thought she knew about what it meant to be truly happy. Martha sat alone in her living room, the faint hum of the town's gossip still buzzing in her ears. Her house, once a place of comfort, now felt foreign. Every knock on the door or ring of the phone filled her with a strange mix of anxiety and suspicion. The lottery win had brought her wealth, but it had also drawn out shadows she didn't know existed, among her neighbors, her friends, and most of all, herself. She stared at the ticket, framed now as if to preserve the moment that had changed everything. Her thoughts kept circling back to Greg. His reappearance wasn't a coincidence, she was certain of that. But what he wanted and how far he'd go to get it were questions that kept her awake at night. The tension in her life came to a head one brisk Friday evening. Martha had spent the day meeting with a lawyer, following Linda's advice, to secure her newfound wealth. The lawyer, a sharp and no-nonsense woman named Evelyn, had laid out a plan to protect Martha's assets. Trust funds, anonymous investments, and clear-cut boundaries, Evelyn made it all sound manageable. But as Martha returned home, her sense of accomplishment was short-lived. Greg's car was parked in her driveway. She paused, gripping the steering wheel, her pulse quickening. She hadn't invited him, and she hadn't yet decided how to deal with him. When she stepped inside, Greg was waiting for her in the kitchen. He looked too comfortable, leaning against the counter with an air of familiarity that made her stomach churn. "Martha," he began, his voice dripping with the charm that had once captivated her. "We need to talk." She set her purse down slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "You were supposed to wait for my call." Greg shrugged, spreading his hands in a gesture of innocence. "I couldn't wait anymore. I've been thinking about us, about what we had, and what we could have again." Martha crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Cut to the chase, Greg. What do you really want?" His expression faltered for a moment before he recovered, putting on his most convincing smile. "I want to make things right. I've changed, Martha. I've learned from my mistakes. And I know I hurt you when I left, but we can start over. With the money, we could finally live the life we always dreamed of. Together." There it was, the truth she'd been waiting for. Greg wasn't here for her, he was here for the fortune. She felt a wave of anger rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I see," she said, her voice steady. "You want a piece of the winnings." Greg's smile slipped into a defensive frown. "That's not fair. I'm not here because of the money. I'm here because I care about you." Martha laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that startled even herself. "Care about me? You left me, Greg. You didn't just leave, you abandoned me with nothing. And now that I have something you want, you think you can waltz back into my life and pretend it's all water under the bridge?" Greg's face darkened. "You're twisting this, Martha. Don't act like you didn't make mistakes, too. You were always so content with your little life, never willing to take risks. I wanted more for us, and you held me back." The words stung, but Martha refused to let him see it. She took a deep breath, drawing on the strength she had been building over the past weeks. "You're right, Greg," she said, her tone icy. "I did hold us back, from bankruptcy, from ruin, from every harebrained scheme you dragged us into. And you're right about one other thing, I was content with my life, even if it wasn't perfect. Because I didn't need to gamble or chase pipe dreams to find happiness. I worked hard for what I had, and I was proud of it. But you? You've always been chasing something you could never catch." Greg's face twisted with anger, and for a moment, she thought he might lash out. But instead, he slammed his hand on the counter. "You think you're better than me now because you've got money?" he spat. "You wouldn't even have that ticket if it weren't for me. I bought it, Martha. That win is as much mine as it is yours." Martha felt the ground shift beneath her. She had anticipated Greg's manipulation, but this accusation was something else entirely. "That's not how this works," she said, her voice firm. "The ticket was in my possession. I claimed it, and it's legally mine. You can't rewrite history just because it suits you." Greg took a step closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous tone. "You think the law will protect you? Small towns like this thrive on gossip. Imagine what people will think if I tell them you're cutting me out after everything we've been through. Do you want to be known as the woman who left her husband in the dust after striking it rich?" Martha's hands trembled, but she refused to back down. "You're not my husband anymore, Greg. You made that clear when you left me. And if you think you can bully me into giving you anything, you're in for a rude awakening." At that moment, the front door opened, and Linda walked in, carrying a bag of groceries. She stopped short, her eyes darting between Martha and Greg. "Am I interrupting something?" she asked, her voice sharp. Greg stepped back, his bravado faltering under Linda's scrutinizing gaze. "No, we're done here," Martha said, her voice firm. "Aren't we, Greg?" He hesitated, glancing between the two women before nodding stiffly. "We'll talk again," he said, his tone laced with veiled threat. Then he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Martha sank into a chair, her adrenaline giving way to exhaustion. Linda set the groceries on the counter and pulled up a chair beside her. "Are you okay?" Linda asked, her voice softening. Martha nodded, though tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. "I don't know what to do, Linda. He's not going to stop. And I'm so tired of fighting." Linda placed a comforting hand on Martha's shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone. We'll figure it out, one step at a time. But you've already proven something tonight, you're stronger than he ever gave you credit for." Martha nodded, the weight of Linda's words sinking in. She wasn't the same woman Greg had left behind. She had faced heartbreak, scrutiny, and now, his calculated manipulation, and she was still standing. But as she sat there, she couldn't shake the feeling that Greg's threats weren't idle. The confrontation had exposed a side of him she hadn't fully seen before, and she knew he wouldn't give up easily. The stakes were higher now, and the battle for her freedom had only just begun. The days that followed Greg's departure from her kitchen were a whirlwind of emotions and action. Martha, bolstered by Linda's unwavering support, decided she could no longer allow herself to live under the shadow of Greg's manipulative threats. If she wanted to claim the life she had always dreamed of, independent, free, and full of promise, she needed to take control, no matter how messy or uncomfortable it might be. The first step was securing her finances. With Linda by her side, Martha met again with Evelyn, her lawyer, to establish a robust legal framework that would protect her assets. Evelyn recommended creating a blind trust, ensuring her wealth couldn't be accessed or traced back to her directly. "This will shield you from opportunists and, frankly, anyone trying to claim what isn't theirs," Evelyn explained. Martha felt a glimmer of relief at the thought of having a layer of protection. But Evelyn's next suggestion surprised her. It might also be wise to consider filing a restraining order against Greg. "From what you've described, his behavior borders on harassment, and with this much money involved, things can escalate quickly." The idea unsettled Martha. A restraining order felt so final, so public. It was one thing to assert her boundaries in private, but involving the legal system felt like crossing a line she wasn't sure she was ready for. Still, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease every time she stepped out of her house, wondering if Greg would be waiting for her or stirring up trouble in town. While Martha wrestled with these decisions, Greg wasted no time escalating his tactics. True to his nature, he began spinning his version of events around town. At the local diner, the hardware store, and even during Sunday service, he painted himself as the victim of Martha's supposed greed and betrayal. "She wouldn't even have bought that ticket if it weren't for me," Greg told anyone who would listen. "And now she's acting like I don't exist, like I didn't spend years supporting her while she worked that thankless teaching job." The rumors spread like wildfire, and soon, Martha found herself fielding pointed questions and judgmental glances from people she once considered friends. One neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, stopped her on the way to her car, clutching a pie and a sanctimonious frown. "Martha, dear," Mrs. Hargrove began, her voice dripping with feigned concern, "I heard what Greg's been saying, and I just think, well, maybe you should consider sharing a little of your good fortune with him. It's the Christian thing to do, after all." Martha forced a polite smile, though her hands clenched at her sides. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Hargrove, but Greg's choices are his own, and I won't be held accountable for them." She left the conversation before her temper could get the better of her, but the interaction left her shaken. It wasn't just the whispers and sideways glances that troubled her. Greg's influence began creeping into more tangible aspects of her life. One afternoon, she returned home to find a notice taped to her door, a summons to appear in court. Greg was suing her, claiming that as her former spouse, he was entitled to a portion of her lottery winnings. The audacity of the lawsuit left Martha reeling. Legally, their divorce had been finalized months before her win, and Greg had no rightful claim to the money. But the process of defending herself in court would be expensive, exhausting, and public, a fact she suspected Greg was counting on. "I can't believe this," Martha said, pacing her living room as she clutched the summons. "He's dragging me through the mud just to make my life miserable." Linda, ever the voice of reason, sat calmly on the couch, her arms crossed. "Let him try," she said. "You've got the truth on your side, and Evelyn will make mincemeat of his case. But Martha, you need to decide how far you're willing to go to put a stop to this." Martha sank into a chair, her shoulders sagging. "I don't want to fight, Linda. I just want to live my life without constantly looking over my shoulder." Linda leaned forward, her expression softening. "Then fight for that, Martha. Fight for your peace. Because if you give in to him now, he'll never stop." With Linda's words ringing in her ears, Martha resolved to take control. She met with Evelyn again, who assured her that Greg's case was weak and unlikely to hold up in court. "But we need to be proactive," Evelyn said. "Let's countersue for harassment and defamation. Make it clear that you're not backing down." The decision to countersue was daunting, but it also felt empowering. For years, Martha had allowed Greg to dictate the terms of their relationship, always shrinking herself to accommodate his ego. Now, she was reclaiming her voice, not just for her own sake but for the life she wanted to build. As the court date loomed, Martha poured her energy into something more positive, giving back to her community. She anonymously donated a significant sum to the local school, funding new art and music programs. She also partnered with a local nonprofit to renovate the town's aging library, a project that had been stalled for years due to lack of funding. The community's response was overwhelming. Parents, teachers, and neighbors who had once been skeptical of her newfound wealth began to see her in a new light. "Martha, you've done more for this town in a month than some people have in a lifetime," one teacher told her during the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the library. But even as Martha found joy in these acts of generosity, the tension with Greg lingered. The court proceedings were brutal, with Greg's lawyer painting him as a devoted husband who had been wronged by an ungrateful ex-wife. Martha, however, held her ground, presenting evidence of their divorce and Greg's long history of financial irresponsibility. When the judge finally ruled in her favor, dismissing Greg's claims and granting her countersuit, the sense of relief was overwhelming. Greg was ordered to pay damages for harassment, though Martha suspected he'd never follow through. More importantly, the ruling sent a clear message: she was no longer the woman Greg could control or manipulate. In the aftermath, Greg slinked away from town, his reputation in tatters. For the first time in years, Martha felt a sense of peace. The journey had been painful and messy, but it had also been transformative. She had faced her fears, stood up for herself, and discovered a strength she didn't know she had. And as she sat on her porch one quiet evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she allowed herself to imagine the future, a future she would build on her own terms, free from the shadows of her past. With the court battle behind her and Greg out of her life, Martha finally had the space to breathe, to think, and to dream. For the first time in years, her mornings weren't filled with anxiety or dread. Instead, she woke up to the gentle sunlight streaming through her windows, the chirping of birds outside, and the realization that she was in control of her life. But the journey to this moment had left her reflective, and in the quiet moments, she began to piece together what this transformation truly meant for her. Life in the small town had shifted subtly since the trial ended. People who had once whispered about Martha's wealth or sided with Greg were now approaching her with apologies or newfound respect. It wasn't just the public vindication in court, it was the way Martha had handled herself, with dignity, generosity, and a quiet strength that defied the gossip and criticism. One of her neighbors, Mr. Jenkins, who had always seemed indifferent to her, surprised her one afternoon. "Martha," he said, tipping his hat as he stood by her mailbox, "I've lived in this town for 50 years, and I've seen folks rise and fall. But I've never seen someone bounce back the way you have. You're an inspiration." The words struck a chord with Martha. For so long, she had felt like a bystander in her own life, letting circumstances and other people dictate her path. Now, she was at the helm, steering toward a future that was entirely her own. Yet, the win was bittersweet. She couldn't ignore the scars left by Greg's betrayal and the trial's emotional toll. There were nights when she still lay awake, replaying old arguments or the hurtful things he had said. But as time passed, those memories began to lose their power over her. She realized that holding on to resentment only anchored her to the past. One evening, as she sifted through a box of old photos, she came across a picture of her and Greg from their early days together. They were sitting on the porch of their first home, laughing as if the world belonged to them. Martha stared at the photo for a long time, feeling a pang of sadness, not for Greg, but for the person she had been. "I'm not her anymore," she whispered, setting the photo aside. Determined to channel her experiences into something meaningful, Martha began exploring ways to give back to the community on a deeper level. The library renovation had been a success, and she wanted to build on that momentum. She met with local leaders, discussing projects that could uplift the town, a scholarship fund for underprivileged students, a mentorship program for women starting over after divorce, and a new park where families could gather and make memories. The idea that resonated most with Martha was creating a community center. She envisioned it as a place where people could come together, find support, and access resources to improve their lives. She named it the Second Chance Center, a nod to her own journey of rebuilding and starting fresh. Construction began in the spring, and Martha threw herself into the project, overseeing every detail from the design to the programs it would offer. The center became a beacon of hope in the town, attracting volunteers and donations from people who were inspired by Martha's story. As the months passed, Martha's life took on a rhythm that felt both fulfilling and entirely her own. She started painting again, a hobby she had abandoned years ago when life became too overwhelming. Her evenings were spent on the porch with Linda, sharing stories and laughter over glasses of wine. But the most surprising development came in the form of a letter. One crisp autumn morning, Martha found an envelope in her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a short, handwritten note from Greg. "Martha, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. You were always stronger than I gave you credit for, and I see that now. I hope you find the happiness you deserve. Greg." Martha read the note several times, her emotions swirling. She didn't know if Greg's words were sincere or just another attempt to ease his conscience. But as she folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer, she realized it didn't matter. She had already made peace with the past, and Greg's opinion of her no longer held any power. The grand opening of the Second Chance Center marked a turning point for the town and for Martha. The event drew a crowd of families, local officials, and even some reporters eager to document the woman who had turned her personal triumph into a gift for her community. As Martha stood at the podium to cut the ribbon, she looked out at the sea of faces. These were the people who had once doubted her, criticized her, and, in some cases, stood by her through it all. She smiled, her voice steady as she addressed them. "This center isn't just about me or my story," she began. "It's about every person who has faced challenges and thought they couldn't start over. It's about resilience, community, and the belief that it's never too late for a second chance. I hope this place becomes a reminder of that for everyone who walks through its doors." The applause was thunderous, and as Martha cut the ribbon, she felt a wave of pride and gratitude. The center wasn't just a symbol of her journey, it was a testament to the strength and potential within every person who dared to dream of something better. That night, as she stood on the balcony of her home, looking out at the lights of the town she had grown to love, Martha allowed herself a rare moment of contentment. Life hadn't turned out the way she had once imagined, but in many ways, it was better. Martha's transformation wasn't just about winning the lottery or overcoming Greg's schemes. It was about discovering who she was when everything else fell away, a woman who could weather storms, rebuild from ashes, and create something beautiful from the chaos. And as the stars sparkled overhead, Martha whispered a silent promise to herself, to continue living boldly, to embrace the unexpected, and to never again let anyone dim her light.